What's up guys, it's R Chilli. About a year ago, my mom and I were in the first parking space area of a small shopping mall. She was getting things ready for the store, and I was waiting. The space in front of us was parked a large white SUV. I can't explain why, but I had the urge to study the SUV, when I usually don't even pay attention. The family that owned the SUV came out, and it was a father, infant in a carrier and a little girl. The little girl stared at us the whole time her father was getting her in the car. She had this huge oversized bow in her hair, and a side ponytail and just kept staring. Even as they walked to the driver's side she didn't take her eyes off of us. The father packed her up, my mom also stared at her, it was so strange. We went into the store right after the whole family was in the SUV. When we went to open the door the same family came out. Odd little girl, father, baby, and father was still holding shopping bags. My mom and I looked at each other in horror, because it took him 5 minutes to pack his kids in that SUV. How could he get out and run into the store in the few seconds it took us to walk to the sidewalk in front of the store? We weren't the only ones who saw it. A worker from the food place next to the store saw it, and we all exchanged looks of horror. I have no idea what this was, but I can tell you that very few people have believed me and my mom. This will probably get buried. When I was around 20, a few years ago, I kept having dreams about a woman, with long black hair named Aurora, pronounced, Aurora. They were different dreams, but for some reason, her distinct face and name always ended up in them. It got to the point where I would wake up frustrated and confused, trying to Google her name or find out how I was connected to her. After a few months she stopped showing up and I dismissed it, thinking my brain was just being a scumbag. Fast forward a few years later, Halloween 2009, I'm in the car with a friend stopped at a gas station. I'm about to pull out and merge onto a highway when I get a phone call from a random number, so I stopped the car but no one answered. There was a person behind me who grew impatient, honked at me, and then swerved in front of me, instead of waiting for 2 seconds for me to move. Second they get on the highway, some silver Accord loses control of their wheel and crashes into the car that swerved in front of me. I called the cops and waited at the gas station for them to come. Turns out the drivers of both cars died. It 100% would have been me if I hadn't have got that phone call. Called it back a few hours later out of gratitude and curiosity, rang 3 times and went to voicemail. Hi, you've reached Aurora, please leave your name and number. Never had goosebumps like that in me life. Called it again the next day, because I was that confused about the whole situation. Some woman answers, we get to talking, I tell her my entire story including the dreams I had. She tells me she doesn't know how I got her number and that she never called me as far as she remembers. Weird. Ask her if she has a Facebook to confirm if she is in fact the woman in my dreams. Check her Facebook, holy fuck, it's her. This happened about 15 years ago. I called my friend up and he wasn't home, so I left a message on his answering machine. I said, hey, it's me Kill Al Extremists. Sorry I missed you, call you later. Bye. And then I hung up and left the house. I made no other calls. Later that day he called back and he says, wow, that was quite a message you left. Who was that girl you were talking to? I was like, what are you talking about? I wasn't talking to any girl. Well, as it turns out the message didn't end after I said bye. I had to go over to his house and listen to this message a few times. After my initial message that I did leave, as quoted above, there was a slight pause and it continues on for another 30 to 40 seconds or so with me talking to some girl. It was my voice, but a conversation I never had with a girl whose voice I didn't recognize. You could compare it to the message I know I did leave, and the two voices were indistinguishable. Not just the voice but, you know, talking mannerisms. It was my voice. Also, References to my occupation and activities were the same. Basically, in this conversation I was talking to this girl about going skiing, but I had to go down to my shop and work on a car first, which totally correlated to me. Then the message just stopped. It was recorded on one of those digital answering machines that recorded the message to a chip, so there was no tape I could have taken and had analyzed, unfortunately. Also, neither I nor my friend had party lines, so that's not an explanation. It was very freaky, I can't explain it. I have two stories that are just weird as fuck. Both of them are things I just would not believe if someone else told them to me, but I can swear with every fiber of my being that they happened, as I write them here. The first happened a couple years ago. I can't remember the occasion, but my mother and I had gone to A&W for lunch, and we were both sitting there eating our meals. We happened to be seated pretty close to the washroom doors, so I noticed everyone going in and out. First person to come out is this old man who's kind of hobbling along. He walked past, and I looked at him and went on with my meal. Not 30 seconds later, another man comes out of the bathroom, and at this point I get a little freaked out, because I realize it's the exact same person. Same limp, clothing, face, everything. A couple minutes later, the same thing happens, except it's an old woman this time. She comes out, then 30 seconds later comes right out of the bathroom again. My mom took a look at me and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I just kind of stammered a bit, then wrote it off as me being crazy. The next story is more weird, in my opinion, and is the single strangest occurrence of my life. This happened when I was about 9 years old, but I can still remember it vividly. We were visiting family in Nevada with my dad, and they lived out in a very dry area in a fairly good-sized trailer. A couple days in, I was playing outside with my cousin, pretty much just messing around in the dirt. At some point, I look up. Right next to the house is a field, I guess, surrounded by wire fence, probably originally for livestock. But anyway, there's this guy standing there. This is a good 300 or more feet away, so I cannot see him clearly at all. Cue the weird. As soon as I look at this guy, I have what I can only describe as an out-of-body experience. My body pretty much just went into lockdown, and I was no longer seeing through my eyes. And I wasn't just floating there or anything. I was in that man's body. Through his eyes I could see two little shapes playing across the field, but I could just feel that he saw the shapes as animals. And then I realized he was holding a fucking shotgun. After that I regained my body and blurted out, "We have to go indoors," offering no explanation to my cousin, who thought I was nuts. I didn't tell anyone because I just didn't know how to express it to other people back then. I've only since told my brothers, but I don't think they believed me. Still freaks me out when I think about it today, because it's the only time I've ever lost control of my body. It was almost like a dream, but the whole thing felt like it was happening in slow motion. My family owns a house on Cape Cod. The previous owner was a white supremacist, with an autistic son, named Jimmy. Jimmy was known for putting on a trench coat and fedora, climbing trees, and shooting cats and dogs with a BB gun. When my parents moved into the house, they found a bunch of Nazi paraphernalia in a bedroom. They put it in the shed, told the former owner they had a week to get rid of it, and then threw it out. Of course, at the age of 7, I didn't know any of this. That's when I was visited 5 nights in a row by a figure in a trench coat and fedora. He didn't have any detail, he looked like a silhouette, like he was being powerfully backlit but with no light source. He would stand in the corner of the room, or sit there crouched, or sit on the bed opposite mine, my brother's bed, but he was at summer camp at the time. One time, he sat in a rocking chair, and when I looked later, he was gone but the chair was still rocking. After a few nights of this, I told my parents about it. My mom called it a nightmare, but my dad was intrigued. He told me to tell the figure, "Jimmy, I don't have your stuff." So the next night, when the figure appeared again in the corner of the room, I said, "Jimmy, I don't have your stuff." And Jimmy walked right over to me, put his face an inch away from mine, and then disappeared. I never saw him again. Years later, I found out about the history of the house. I've often wondered if I had heard it before, and somehow suppressed it and then imagined my encounters with Jimmy. But he was and remains entirely vivid to me. It happened 2 days after I turned 8. I live in Finland and we had just moved into town. Our apartment was in these cheap rental, high-rises, 8th floor. My grandma had given me a few comic books as a present, and I had been reading them ever since the party, quite a stack, something like 10 to 15 individual comics. There was this one book, a Spider-Man comic. It wasn't about the usual Spidey but something about Peter Parker's clone acting as Crimson Spider-Man, at least that's how it was translated to Finnish. I had just returned from school, so my parents were still at work and I started reading this comic. At some page, the protagonist is crouching on a roof, jumps down and lands into the Spidey crouch, hands between his legs. Without thinking anything, I just laid down the comic, walked to our balcony and climbed on the fence using a chair as a ladder. As I was sitting there, I see some man down and across the street. He saw me sitting there, and started running towards our house. At this same moment, I had this really calm feeling taking over me. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes and jumped down. When I jumped, I could hear the man scream "Ei Jumalauta. 1. No, followed by an abbreviation to God help me. Then I just heard wind in my ears. Next thing I know, I'm on the ground, crouching like Spider-Man. The man runs around some high bushes just when I stand up, stops dead on his tracks and all color escapes his face. He just stood there with absolute terror in his eyes, completely silent and looking at me for a few seconds before backing away slowly, without turning his face off me before he's back at the corner, where he turns away. I returned to the lower door only to find out I had left my key inside. So I just sat down and waited for my father to return from work, something like 1 hour. He was naturally surprised to find me there, without my backpack. I told him what had happened. "Dad, I'm Spider-Man," when we were in the elevator. Dad thought it was just my imagination. When we returned inside and he saw my comic book laid open on the ground, with the page featuring the jump and the balcony door left open, he took away the particular comic book, and never allowed me on the balcony before I turned 12, and we moved to a bit better house, 3rd floor. He also becomes disoriented every time I mention this to him and changes the subject quickly. Although he does admit he found me downstairs and balcony door was open. I still remember this occasionally, clear as day. I hope you like this video. For more content, please like and subscribe.